Hi, I'm Alan Bond from University of East Anglia and also Northwest University in South Africa. And I'm just going to introduce the session on key resilience considerations in socio-ecological systems. So we basically have a couple of presentations. The first presentation will be given by Mike Jones from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences based in Uppsala, Sweden. And he's going to talk for about 20 minutes on an introduction to resilience in socio-ecological systems. So that's quite critical because in this resilience session, we have a number of different presentations in different sessions associated with different aspects of resilience. So we're focusing today on socio-ecological systems in particular. So Mike's going to give a basic introduction to resilience in socio-ecological systems. And then I'm going to give a presentation about COVID-19 because it makes a really good case study all about resilience. And then we're going to end with perspectives on the presentations that myself and Mike have given. Basically, what's going to happen is that three people are all going to talk for 5 minutes each about the challenges or the resilience challenges and opportunities raised by the presentations. So we've got Francesca Vigliani, and she's going to talk based on her expertise in the health area. So she can talk about resilience associated with health. And then Juan Palerm, who works more in development aid, he can talk about the governance context for resilience and why it's so important and what the opportunities and challenges are. And then finally, we have Angela Jonas Imperiali, and he can talk more about the societal resilience implications. And then that will finish our session. So without further ado, I think we can start now with the first presentation from Mike Jones.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whoever you are, wherever you are in the world. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about social ecological systems concepts for impact assessment. So this first slide is a response to the many different ways in which resilience is defined by people. In fact, they've listed 83 different definitions of resilience. And a partial cause for this diversity is the diversity of systems to which the term is applied. So this diagram illustrates the four interconnected domains within which systems occur. Knowing about system domains helps us to identify the kind of system we are managing and what kind of resilience we want. Social ecological systems, up in the top here, are complex, self-organizing biological systems that have emergent properties. Resilience in these systems varies according to the interactions between the internal parts of the system and its environment. These systems are essentially unknowable, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. Complicated systems are things like artificial intelligence, space shuttles, and urban transport systems, or the models produced by scientists to reduce complex systems to something that managers can work with. They are complicated because they have many parts and some of their properties may not be fully known. These systems are partially knowable and their resilience is defined by the person who designs the system. Simple systems are things like process engineering, where everything is known and best practice management is appropriate. As with complicated systems, their resilience is defined by the person who designs the system. Chaotic systems have no resilience because the system is turbulent and the parts are not connected in any recognizable way. And then disorder tends to arrive when it's not clear which system domain is appropriate to a given situation. And there's no clear match between the management approach and the system being managed. For example, if a complex system is managed as though it is a simple system, things are likely to go wrong quite quickly. So environmental impact assessment requires knowledge of the interactions between social, ecological, technological, and infrastructure systems. The assessment process reduces complexity to a complicated model that attempts to predict the impacts of a development proposal, i.e., how will the system change in response to the development. The model may be further reduced from complicated to simple by a cost-benefit analysis for decisions about or making decisions between alternative designs. The cliff edge between simple and chaotic systems corresponds with the collapse phase of Holling's adaptive cycle that leads to reorganization after a brief period of chaos. To reduce the risk of systemic failure, good impact assessment practice would recognize that models and predictions provide guidance, not guarantees, and pay more attention to the risk of failure, monitoring, learning, and adaptation. Best practice is a term to use with caution, if at all, in environmental management, because environmental systems are essentially unknowable. I suspect that much environmental management is the difference between the system domains and the implications of these domains for the management of the system. Turning now to the adaptive cycle. It's a simple metaphor for understanding how change occurs in any biological, that is, a social and ecological system. The green curve from exploitation to conservation represents the growth that occurs in individuals and communities. It is a slow process that may continue for hundreds of years or more in things like forests and cities. The dashed line from conservation through release and reorganization back to exploitation occurs when systems collapse and then reorganize for another period of growth. This is a comparatively fast process occurring over a matter of months or years. A rigidity trap occurs when a system is unable to change in response to changing environmental conditions. It's up here in the conservation phase. And for example, the global economic system needs to change in response to resource scarcity, pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss. But so far, it has not done so. Systems that are unable to reorganize may fall into a poverty trap, a degraded state from which recovery may be difficult. This is a somewhat different version of the same thing. It's a bit more complicated, but it's essentially the same adaptive cycle. And it shows that development follows this very wandering sort of path, the growth. And during that growth period, there'll be different kinds of setbacks and adaptation, but overall the direction of growth is the same towards the kinds of highly developed system that we see in industrialized societies today. K-Lim, or the crisis, in response to events such as COVID-19, may lead to recovery and business as usual, following the short loop here, or lead to some kind of collapse and reorganization, which would be followed by innovation through things like variations on the different Green New Deal ideas that are floating around. And then that would lead to a new phase of growth. At the moment, we don't know whether social and economic systems will return to normal following the pandemic or enter a collapse phase that leads to the development of something new. Such is the uncertainty of complex systems. The panarchy is just the adaptive cycles arranged in 3 different layers of scale to help you understand how feedback interactions between levels of scale affect evolution and change over time. The fast changing parts of the system, the small and fast variables, create change, or attempt to create change and influence the system at the next level up. Whereas the large and slow part of the system, these are the large and slow changing variables, provide system stability. So innovation in complex systems comes from below. System stability and resistance to change occurs in the large, slow changing systems. COVID-19 is an unexpected environmental disturbance that affects all levels of human society across the globe. Phenomena like the rapid search for a vaccine and the various immune responses to individuals are the equivalent of small, fast changes down here. This is the innovation that will eventually result in some form of herd immunity. In other words, it's a permanent change in the system as we become more or less immune or have adapted to COVID-19. The funding for research, health services, and the financial relief of closed businesses and unemployed individuals is the equivalent of a slow variable response from here to maintain the stability of the system. The story of Yellowstone National Park provides a really good way of illustrating how the panicky can be used to understand change. Wolves, which had previously limited the growth of deer population, down here, small fast variable, were removed from the park. The population of deer grew rapidly and degraded the habitats and the communities of other plants and animals. Aspen, a major food source for beavers, was almost eliminated, and the beaver population fell to low numbers. The beaver dams that regulated stream flow disappeared, streams cut into river valleys, meadows and wetlands disappeared. The deer had created a cascade of change, going upwards, that precipitated a cascade of collapse in the opposite direction. This process was reversed when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. Deer were driven into uplands and their populations went into decline. Aspen and beavers returned, stream flow was slowed so that wetlands and water meadows started to recover. In this case, the disturbance was park management policy that firstly killed all the wolves and then reintroduced them to restore the system. Turning now to fire in Australia as an example. Understanding how systems have changed over time is an important part of understanding system process. And as they say, hindsight is always 20/20. So both the intended and unintended consequences of decisions may only become apparent tens of years after a development intervention. Reviewing the changes that occurred in the past provide a greater understanding of process affecting a system and the possibility of desirable, undesirable changes in the future. The periodic occurrence of devastating bushfires in Australia, shown here on the left, is related to global warming and other factors such as human activity, fuel load, rainfall, temperature, and wind, all of which interact synergistically. So synergistic effects are complex. They're a complex system phenomenon where the interaction between two or more agents, entities, factors, or substances produces an effect that is greater than the sum of their individual effects. The bushfire management in Australia, the bushfire management system in Australia was vulnerable to the interaction between change in fire management practice that increased fuel loads, long-term warming, and then this pulse of exceptionally warm and dry weather that occurred in October of 2019. One of the things about complexity is the differences that arise from people's perspectives, people who have influence on the system. and their assumptions about how the system works, which is their untested beliefs, and how these affect the system. So many of the assumptions arise from people's worldviews and values. They don't give them up very easily. They tend to hold on to them. That leads to lots of conflict. So the first statement reflects a lack of knowledge about burning on the part of the Europeans who had recently arrived in a strange land and knew very little about its ecology. The second statement reflects the accumulation of some knowledge about fire and fuel loads, but no recognition of the interaction between climate change, weather patterns, fuel loads, and the increased risk of catastrophic fire that comes from a holistic understanding. The third statement is representative of the rigid thinking that does not recognize the need for change in economic policy in response to environmental change. It represents a demand for constant economic growth that is driving environmental change and increasing the risk to human well-being. For management of social-ecological systems, scenarios are used to explore potential impacts that may arise from development alternatives. For example, in this little diagram here, resilience, meaning little or no change to a system, is weighed against adaptation. Here, changing the rules of system to adapt it in a small way. Or transformation, which is a major change. And in this case, I'm suggesting a change that enables people to live in harmony with nature. Impact assessment of development proposals and policies is required to examine the assumption that some kind of change, large or small, will be beneficial. Irrespective of the decision taken, monitoring the outcomes and impacts of an intervention is essential for learning how the system changes in response to the intervention, because of the self-organizing and unpredictable nature of social ecological systems. Given the environmental changes of the 21st century and unpredictability, planning and decision-making might usefully consider ways of responding to the worst risks. In other words, planning for the worst while hoping for the best. Managing the multiple options that arise from social complexity require leadership, skills that enhance collaboration and resolve conflict. Maintaining the slow-to-change stabilizing components of ecosystems such as forests, soils, water catchments reduces disaster risk. And that is the end of what I have to say. I've included a few references here for those who would like to follow it up. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, so I'm Alan Bond from the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the United Kingdom, and also Northwest University in Potchefstroom, South Africa. And following on from Mike's presentation about resilience in socio-ecological systems in general, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to present a case study on resilience all about COVID-19. More information continues to emerge about COVID-19. So, for example, the first known patient developed symptoms back in December the 1st in China. But despite views that wet markets were to blame, this person who is patient 0 had never visited Wuhan wet market, where the virus is said to have first jumped across to human beings. Indeed, some evidence from other countries suggests that the virus was circulating far earlier than the first formal diagnosis in a patient. So, for example, looking at sewage analysis, it appears that the virus has been around for some months before ever being diagnosed in humans. So there remains some uncertainty over when and how the virus has crossed over to humans. Analysis suggests that the original host was a bat, and there was likely an intermediate species, but which one remains unclear at this stage. Now, if we look at the slide, what we have is data which I've taken from World Health Organization and plotted a graph which shows us the global picture at the moment in terms of infections. And we'll see that it remains at very high levels at the moment. So we've not got to the stage where it's starting to go down again, and we don't know how long it's going to continue with such high levels of infections. And unfortunately, if you look at the picture of deaths, it's the same. They remain at high levels, and it's not yet looking like we're getting towards the end of it. So that kind of sets the scene for COVID-19 and where we are at the minute. Now, in the context of resilience, it's important to understand the system in which COVID-19 is present. So this diagram, which is taken from the source given in the slide title, indicates the pathways that lead to the spread of the disease. So if you look over to the right-hand side of the diagram, we're familiar with all the repercussions of the pandemic. The mobility of humans in this day and age spread the disease worldwide, and the concentration of patients in hospitals and care homes has spread the virus amongst vulnerable people in particular. So, of course, measures have been implemented by governments around the world to break the transmission within hospitals and care homes and in the wider community. But it's clear that keeping transmission levels low or reducing them requires continual disruption to daily life. So these issues will be repeated every time a new virus emerges, and that's some critical context that we have to think about. What about the next pandemic? And in terms of the resilience of a socio-ecological system, are we going to get more pandemics? Will they be more severe or less severe than this one? Now, the part of the system on the left of this diagram is the key to considering resilience to future zoonotic, by which we mean viruses which are spread from animals to humans, so zoonotic coronavirus pandemics. So COVID-19 is not the first virus to emerge following this pathway from animal hosts, and the likelihood is that the rate of infection from novel coronaviruses will increase in the future. And in the context that 60 to 75%, the research shows, of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, the focus in this talk is very much on zoonotic diseases. So that kind of ring fences the socio-ecological system that we're concerned with. It's the system that can lead to zoonotic diseases where you've got this transfer from animals to human beings, probably through intermediate hosts. So this is a diagram which will hopefully be explained in Mike Jones's presentation, and it deals with the concept of panicky, and it's quite a critical concept in the context of resilience. So it introduces the idea that systems function at a range of different scales, and that what happens at each of those scales affects what happens at different scales. For example, events which led to the transfer of coronavirus to humans at a small scale have affected a global socio-economic system. Conversely, climate change operates at a planetary scale and yet influences the small-scale ecological cycles related to individual ecosystems in which hosts of coronavirus reside. So changes at the global level can lead to proliferation of coronavirus in animal hosts in a specific location, which then comprise a reservoir for contamination caused by some other small-scale event. So resilience of the global system is being affected by a number of pressures, as illustrated by this OECD analysis of the implications for mean species abundance, which is what the MSA stands for above the figure. So mean species abundance is a measure of the intactness of natural systems. And what we can see from this diagram is that various pressures, including climate change in particular, infrastructure plus encroachment plus fragmentation, along with other pressures, deplete mean species abundance year on year. Now, I'll return to this point in a later slide because project-based EIA generally helps to facilitate small-scale impacts for which the cumulative effects at much bigger scales are quite dramatic. So this is where the whole notion of panicky is quite key. Now, particular issues caused by the loss of mean species abundance in relation to coronaviruses is that there are inevitable increases in overlaps of the range of species. So that by this I mean species of different animals, mammals in particular. This accelerates cross-species transfer of novel viruses as species compete for ever-shrinking areas of space. Climate change, additionally, shifts species within existing habitat ranges, again creating more range overlaps. So we end up with a situation where we have growing human populations, and because we have growing human populations who like to and need to eat, we tend to get increases in intermediary species. So these are the species that a virus jumps to before then passing on to human beings, or in the zoonotic transfer. So those kind of species are, for example, pigs and chickens. So there are more pigs and chickens because there are more human beings, and therefore we have more intermediary hosts of zoonotic diseases. And they can transfer coronaviruses between host species, like bats, to humans. And in some cultures, hosts and intermediary species are brought into close contact with each other, for example, through wet markets, which there was a lot of discussion about in relation to the outbreak of the disease in Wuhan. Now, practices like wet markets are not easily stopped. Just because you ban them, because they're culturally embedded, it's quite likely that they would still appear, they would go underground, and you get wet markets still taking place. Now, resilience has been dependent on the stability of ecological niches and the low risk of contact with novel viruses, which is what we're threatening with ongoing development. So this is where I'll introduce a new term, anthropization, which is the transformation or adaptation of the environment to meet the needs of humans or by human activity. And this inevitably brings humans and intermediary species into closer contact with host species for coronaviruses, like bats. A simple example being that lights that we use as human beings attract insects, and the insects are food for bats, so that attracts bats. Another example is rats. Rats are also an originating source for coronaviruses. And of course, we provide new urban habitats for rats as we build cities and towns. Now, research suggests that species which are the hosts of diseases that affect humans comprise a greater proportion of species richness in areas altered for human use. So we create the conditions to increase the chances of transfer of coronaviruses. Not only that, as host species become more threatened, their viral richness increases as their habitats overlap more and more with other virus host species. Basically, if we sum all this up, what it means is that human actions are increasing the risk of future pandemics. We're eroding the resilience of the system to avoid pandemics through our actions that bring species into closer and closer contact with each other and reduce their ranges. All these things increase the likelihood of zoonotic transfer of coronaviruses. So in resilience terms, the key is to understand and manage the cross-scale implications. So as I indicated earlier, a particular issue is that decision-making at a small scale fails to embrace panicky. That is, the dramatic consequences of cumulative impacts that will only manifest at global scales are not considered. The short-term economic gain usually wins out over small-scale environmental losses, but those cumulative impacts equate to anthropization at a global scale, and the negative socio-economic impacts caused by a global pandemic are enormous. The closer society comes to dealing with large-scale cycles is seen in actions to curb climate change. But unfortunately, we know that these are not currently being wholly successful. Whilst we're making progress, it doesn't look great in terms of reducing emissions and preventing climate change in the future. All we're seeking to do is reduce the level of global warming. even though we know climate change has dramatic effects on socio-ecological cycles at all scales. Obviously, because I'm based mainly in the UK, I've got an example here which focuses on the UK situation, but it's reflected across the world. And basically what I'm showing here is that a particular threat with a lack of consideration of system resilience, and panicky in particular, is the short-term policies designed to deal with the economic shock caused by the pandemic. Now, if we take examples from the USA, Canada, and the UK, they all point to measures to weaken environmental impact assessment controls, for example, to facilitate development. So if we weaken those controls, we're likely to end up accelerating the loss of habitat. And if we accelerate the loss of habitat, we're creating the conditions in which coronaviruses are more likely to jump through the hosts, intermediate hosts, to human beings. So it flies in the face of our understanding of the impacts of anthropocization, and will likely accelerate the occurrence of the next global pandemic. I should say, as I go through these slides, that the evidence that I've found, I'm quoting in the citations, and at the end of the presentation, there will be a number of slides which list all the references. And there's also a slide at the end which gives some evidence sources for the fact that EIA is being weakened, an example of NEPA in the United States, EIA in the UK, and EIA in Canada. So where does this all take us? This is the final slide before all those reference slides. Basically, we need to ask what we need to do. So this very brief examination of COVID-19 as a case study makes it clear that we do understand the linkages between various levels of the system in relation to pandemics and zoonotic transfer in particular. But of course, our decision-making systems are designed to work on short government cycles. We've seen just how pressing climate change is, and it remains a major threat in terms of bringing about conditions which will lead to the next global pandemic, yet the human race is failing to address climate change fully. What we should do is ensure that resilience thinking is embedded in ex-ante assessments, so that it's possible to consider and act upon knowledge relating to the longer-term consequences of actions. It means that intergenerational equity needs to be acted upon rather than simply appearing as rhetoric. Perhaps the biggest challenge is working out how to deal with panicky. For the impact assessment community, this means tiering between assessments conducted at different levels of decision-making, from global through national down to local. Such initiatives are hard to deliver because they upset the status quo of governance. For example, there is no decision-making at international levels other than governments coming together and trying to agree things like climate change protocols. The fact that different institutions operate at different levels and that those institutions don't engage with other institutions operating at different levels is a huge barrier to progress. But the kind of estimates economists have delivered for the global cost of abating some of the pressures that lead to reductions in MSA are 1,000th of the estimated cost of COVID-19. So of course it makes sense that we do these things. And given the current trajectory is for more pandemics, it makes no sense to continue business as usual. So the IA community needs to ensure that resilience, in the context of panicky, which is the really big challenge, is fully evaluated at all scales. So it's no good having SEA and EIA if they're not properly communicating with each other. And when we talk about SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, we need to make sure that's operating at all levels of decision making. So fully operating at national level. And we also need to make sure that we've got some level of impact assessment operating at the very highest levels where we can start to see the socio-ecological system as a planetary system. And at the moment, there is absolutely no indication that impact assessment has any influence at that level, or indeed that there's any practice. So it means some more renewed efforts towards tiering and an acknowledgement that system resilience cannot be determined through engagement with subsets of the overall system. And as I said, just at the end, I have a list of the evidence that I've referred to as I've been through the slides. And this ends with some web page references which give some evidence that EIA systems are starting to be weakened as economies try and build their way out of the current economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, thank you. I think now we'll be able to see what the discussants have thought about the presentations that Mike Jones previously has made and this particular case study. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Alan, for your great point, and thanks for everybody for being with us today. My response to your great comments on resilience, and I really enjoyed both presentations, and I can absolutely agree with a lot of the points made. I will try to be simple on my experience on health and pandemic preparedness and impact assessment. And I will concentrate on two main aspects. One, if we want, the issue of power, and the second one, the issues of panarchy or different level. Let's start with levels and how we fail to grasp the resilience of system towards other system, especially when we look at impact assessment at the project level. From a health perspective, is very complicated to allocate responsibility to one project or to another one. Health of people and of community and individual is shaped by so many determinants, and they are interlinked with each other, they affect each other. And of course, macro trends like climate change or biodiversity reduction is the framework within these linkages are occurring. Plus the long latency of a lot of health issues make that we cannot say is this project or is that project. We need to have a much broader understanding of how projects interact with a context and with each other. That's why some health impact assessment practitioners put together the framework about conducting a strategic health impact assessment, which is a strategic environmental assessment, but with a focus on health and the responsibility of different departments, different area in changing something at a much more higher level or macro level. So the idea is very much that we need to become better at strategic planning and strategic assessment to identify how these mega or upper level determinants of health get affected by key decisions. Otherwise, at the project level, we will constantly fail. An example of this, after Ebola, now every project that would need to relocate a bath full of cave will test the baths for any possible pathogen that they might carry to avoid them spreading them. But this is one of the possible way in which pathogens that are in wild animal can affect human being. If we only focus on that dimension, we will still miss a lot of the other factors. So it's good, it's important. Of course, projects need to do it, but in itself is not enough. So resilience needs to be improved by ensuring that project manage what is manageable at the project level, because the bigger framework at the country level or at the regional level has been already framed by competent authorities. So project is the first one. And secondly, it's the issues of power. And where do we put our priority? I think this is especially important when we talk about resilience in the context of, post-COVID and the new system we are looking at. And I can present the example of another pandemic that is upon us, and there is very little discussion about it, and is antimicrobial resistance. basically we know that the number of antibiotics that are functioning are reducing because people are developing resistance to antibiotics. We could think about being in an era before penicillin, something that is absolutely shocking for a lot of health experts. So there is a lot of discussion on this, and it's still very much something that the health system is discussing. When the veterinary system has started to discuss, because in reality, a lot of antimicrobial resistance in humans come from the meat we consume. So veterinary now start to play a role. But then if you ask at health and veterinary authorities, when we do assessment and we try to say, okay, this agricultural project cannot use these antibiotics for people or for animals, because these lead to antimicrobial resistance, the response is that yes, but meat and animals that have been treated with this antibiotic can come to this country because in other countries this is acceptable. And the trade agreement, these import use, again, in farming or agriculture or livestock project, to not use certain antibiotics or certain drugs. But our consumer at the country level still get them because the trade agreement don't protect the health and safety of the consumers. So again, where is the power where we as society have decided that is the most important? If we think that, is the health and safety, then all our policies need to be connected. In reality, the resilience of human society towards possible different risks, we need to create a framework that not only help us to analyze the complexity, but make sure that we start already by eliminating the aspects that we know already are dangerous and then moving it up. I think we have learned a lot with COVID, and the question is ensuring that this lesson learned are then mainstreamed in other decision-making process, and not as we did in the past, we learn and we forget. I think that will be very much the starting block for better including resilience in impact assessment. And finally, of course, this type of discussion that we are having here, I think that the team that you put together on resilience is absolutely fantastic in fostering this cross-collaboration among disciplines. So thank you for having me today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. I'm Juan Palerm, and I work in a facility that provides technical assistance to Europe Aid on the integration of environment and climate change. I want to start by thanking Mike and Alan for their insightful presentations. Ecological systems are complex in their own right, as was made very clear. The relationship to social systems brings further complexity that increase when we also integrate links to the political systems. The concept of planetary boundaries looks at the planet as a system that requires key variables to remain within certain limits. We have already exceeded safe thresholds in relation to the loss of biodiversity and the nutrient cycles. We are also seriously underperforming in relation to other critical variables such as climate change, land use change, and fresh water use. Socio-ecological systems are finding it difficult to cope with the different pressures. And it would seem that they have reached a rigidity trap that Mike was referring to. Some policy options are but patches that address short-term social concerns, but on the go, they can exacerbate ecological pressures. For example, and as mentioned by Alan, the response to COVID-19 in many countries has led to the undermining of the EIA systems. But there are also other measures that are being promoted, such as fossil fuel subsidies that may bring about immediate relief, but actually take us away from sustainability. We will recover from COVID-19, but we cannot go back to business as usual. As clearly indicated by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her recent State of the Union address to the European Parliament, it is not only about repairing and recovering, but about shaping a better way of living. In response to the ecological, climate, and COVID crises, recovery must follow the path of reorganization that Mike was talking about. The European Green Deal is an ambitious plan that can help. Many fear that the enthusiasm around the Green Deal would be set aside in the urge of providing a rapid response to COVID-19. If anything, however, the Green Deal and green recovery are more relevant than ever. When it comes to development, support to large investments deserve our utmost attention, as they are becoming an increasingly important piece in the European Union's development cooperation landscape. As indicated in the new Climate Economy report from the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, in the coming years, we expect to see investments of some $30 trillion in infrastructure up to 2030. Also, the UN tells us that by 2050, about 70% of the world's population will be living in urban areas. But actually, more than half of those urban areas are yet to be built. Wise investments will help drive innovation, deliver public health benefits, create new jobs, and help address climate change. However, if we get it wrong, this will lock us into high-polluting and carbon-intensive development. In other words, we are making decisions now that can either help us create resilient development or that can contribute to the breakdown of the system. Many governments still see environmental sustainability as a luxury that only rich countries can afford. But experience has shown that this is not necessarily the case. Going green offers many opportunities for job creation, for economic development, and for improved livelihoods. For example, jobs in the solar photovoltaic sector are really increasing in recent years, but so are contributing the reduced costs that industry are obtaining from resource efficiency measures, and also the health benefits from reduced pollution. These are just a few examples. These positive feedbacks need to be understood and maximized. Also, climate change and the degradation of ecosystems affect the performance of development projects. For example, lower water levels due to climate change reduce the power generation capacity of hydroelectric dams. But so does the accelerated siltation of dams due to deforestation and land degradation. Addressing environmental degradation and climate change is fundamental to quality development. Policy dialogue is a key piece in development cooperation. We need to bring the sustainability agenda to the core of the dialogue with partners and work closely with them to bring about a green recovery that will build resilience to the system for decades to come. Development cooperation will benefit greatly from a resilience approach. I thank you for your attention and hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Angelo Jonas Imperiale, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen, Faculty of Special Sciences. I thank Alan and Mike for having provided me with the opportunity to discuss their very interesting presentations on social ecological resilience and on how impact assessment can help planned interventions to strengthen resilience in practice. The perspective through which I would like to discuss and hopefully enrich Mike and Alan's presentation will consider the societal issues associated with the resilience of social ecological systems. Adopting a sociological perspective, I will turn the light on the agency of resilience in society and the role social impact assessment can have to strengthen it at the multiple levels of social ecological governance and in all planned interventions. So, as illustrated by Mike and Alan and depicted by the panarchy model, which I propose here again, social ecological systems are structured through multiple levels of social ecological organization of increasing complexity that are linked by a set of nested intra-level and inter-level dynamics, which influence each other both in positive and negative ways. But what does the panarchy model mean in social terms? From a sociological perspective, this model means that changes at the global level, like pandemics, for example, produce risk for local communities, risk of infection, that may turn into negative impacts and disasters, such as, for example, disease and deaths, depending on the vulnerability, exposure, and capacity of communities and localities. Whereas changes produced by human actions at the local level, such as, for example, lack of prevention and precaution measures and perpetuation of business as usual, produce impacts both on a local and large scale, creating a cascade of impacts at all levels of society, such as, for example, increasing disaster risk and disaster costs for the whole social system. Embracing a panarchy approach and adopting a sociological perspective on resilience, we can say that the resilience of the social system is given by the capacity of local communities to learn from and address the risk and impacts of disturbances and transform towards sustainability, which is community resilience, and here we are, and the capacity of the multiple levels of governance to include and strengthen local resilience and transform towards building the sustainability of the whole system, which is social resilience. Here we are. So social impact assessment is the philosophy and process that is addressed to understand the risk and impacts of any disturbance that may be created on local community well-being by planned and unplanned interventions. The scope of social impact assessment is to co-produce with local community a social scientific knowledge about the risk and impacts of such disturbances, the social preconditions of disaster that at the local level contribute to create such risk and impacts, but also the local needs, desires, and capacity associated with reducing them, and how planned intervention can contribute to minimize negative risk and impacts and maximize the benefits for local community well-being. The aim of social impact assessment is to build awareness and inform local communities, decision makers, proponents, and investors about the vulnerabilities, risks, and impacts affecting local community well-being, and suggest strategies on how to strengthen their capacity to mitigate them, thus contributing to build resilience at multiple levels of socio-ecological governance. However, there are two major constraints that hinder social systems from building resilience. First, as also remarked by Mike's presentation, among multiple levels of social ecological governance, there can be the capacity to recognize community resilience and strengthen it, but there will also be the space for risk and impacts to be denial of risk, as Mike's illustrated, or not assessed, like pushing reassurance, what is called to reassure people that nothing is going to happen, or then overreacting, adopting emergency powers and using derogations from any environmental safeguard policy, and adopting a command and control on financial resources, and using a top-down planning accompanied by a promulgation of myths that create second disasters. Second, at multiple levels of governance and also within local communities, there can be resilience, but there will be also the place for social risks to arise, like rent-seeking and elite capture, or disaster, organized crime infiltration, disaster capitalism, corruption, which disrupt the capacity of local people to learn and transform towards sustainability. So, to come back to Mike and Alan's presentation, strategic assessment is crucial to orient the decision, design, and implementation of planned interventions towards enhancing the sustainability of social ecological systems before conception. Such a strategic assessment, however, must be grounded also on the social scientific understanding of local risk, impact, and resilience produced by SIA through application of the social impact assessment framework for action, which here I propose. As described in a previous work, the social scientific understanding will be co-produced with local communities and lead local communities, decision makers, proponents, and investors to mutual learning about the local vulnerabilities, risk, and impacts to reduce, the local capacities and resilience to engage and strengthen, and the local community well-being to enhance. And the social impact assessment understanding will be crucial for any strategic impact assessment to orient the governance of planned interventions, such as the institutional, financial, risk management, physical planning, and participation strategies, and bring all stakeholders together, like science founders, policy community, and decision makers, research community, and the work community itself, towards avoiding the denial of risk, such as the rigidity trap, as mentioned by Alan, or the exacerbation of local vulnerabilities like the poverty trap, while reducing the risk and impacts of global processes and local actions, enhancing community well-being and resilience, and building resilience at all levels of society. So thank you all. And at this last slide, you can find some references. Thank you, everyone.